In this video, I'm going to be taking you guys through a complete walkthrough of upgrading your weak hot end extruder combination on your Creality 3D printer to this Bondtech DDX extruder, along with this Mosquito Magnum hot end from Slice Engineering. Now, if you guys are only upgrading the extruder and not the hot end, this video is also applicable to you, as you just won't be doing the steps to upgrade the hot end, you'll just be doing the extruder. And the Creality hot ends actually interface with the Bondtech DDX extruder. There's a kit for that, we'll get to that in a minute. And you won't have to do things like upgrading certain firmware settings to accommodate the new hot end. And so I'm going to be performing this upgrade on a Creality Ender 5 Plus, but most of these steps are also pretty generic for most Creality printers. The Ender 5 Plus and the Ender 5 are almost identical in this whole process, and probably even for the Ender 3. Again, most of the steps are going to be almost identical, as a lot of the Creality printers share many common parts. So let's get started. We'll begin by removing power from the printer, and we'll move the print head to the middle of the printer so it's easily accessible. Facing the printer from the front on the left hand side, there are two socket head cap screws that maintain tension on the X-axis belt. You're going to loosen those off just enough that you can wiggle the belt around. You don't have to completely remove them. Then on the right hand side of the print head, there is the print cooling fan. We're going to take our hex key here and we're going to remove a few more of the socket head cap screws. These, I believe, are M3s. And so we'll just, again, remove them, save them for later. Don't discard any of your hardware. You might have to reuse some stuff for the DDX kit. So put it all aside and save it. With the print cooling fan freed up, you can now take your side cutters and snip off the zip tie that's holding the wires coming into the hot end, and work your way over to the button head cap screw that's holding on the cover for the hot end on the top. And there's another one hiding down between the BLTouch and the cover, and this is the second one that's holding on this cover and mount for the BLTouch. So you can remove those and that'll free everything up. Now you have access to the inside of the cover where you can remove the extruder fan. So there's 4 bolts inside of there. Remove those. Again, do not discard them. You might need them later, so just put them aside. Now you can take a wrench and you can loosen off the push lock fitting for the Bowden tube. And so just get that right out of the hot end. Eventually you'll be able to thread it out with your fingers, and then you can yank on that Bowden tube and you should be able to pull it right completely out of the hot end. And if you have any filament left over in there that you didn't clear out, you can just snip it off with some side cutters and free it up. There are 2 bolts on the front of the hot end that allow you to completely remove it from the X carriage on the machine. So just loosen those off, and again, save the bolts, do not discard them. Now it's on time to unbox the Bondtech DDX, and of course it is nicely packaged. They make some really nice products and I would highly recommend them. If you're watching this video, you may already own one, so congratulations on your purchase. So putting that aside, I'm also going to be installing a Mosquito Magnum hot end from Slice Engineering. And this comes in a pretty cool little package here with all the parts included that you're going to need for this install, with some extra parts as well. Speaking of extra parts, there are some additional parts that you may have to purchase, or you can actually print. Some of the files are available on the Bondtech website. And so this grouping of parts on the top left hand side is the kit for Creality printers. I believe this works for Ender 5, maybe even Ender 3. But that little adapter that I was holding there and the new one that I'm holding now, they are not the same. So the one I was holding was for the Creality hot end. The one I'm holding right now is the adapter for the Mosquito Magnum. Now I custom 3D printed and designed one. I made that STL available. However, you can also buy that directly from Bondtech. The other thing that I'm holding right here is just a little tool to cut the tubing. So this is some Capricorn tubing. I bought some extra stuff, and the short piece of Capricorn tubing actually comes in the kit as well. For the Ender 5 Plus, which I'm installing this on, you're going to need some rod holders. Again, these rod holders can be purchased or you can print them. I decided to go ahead and print mine. And finally, the BLTouch mount, which I also printed myself. Again, these files are available on the Bondtech website, so you can get those STLs and print them if you don't want to buy them. So now we'll take a look at how the Mosquito Magnum adapter interfaces with the actual Mosquito Magnum product here. And so you'll notice on one side of the adapter there are these holes that have bosses that stand out, and on the other side there are no bosses that stick out from that surface. And so you're going to match up the side there with the bosses that do not stand out with the side that has the script, the Slice Engineering script on it. You're going to reuse some of your M3 socket head cap screws, and you're going to drop them into the adapter. And there are two holes on the top of the Mosquito hot end that receive those M3 socket head cap screws. Next, you're going to take your Capricorn tube that was included in the kit. You're going to slip it into the tool that you printed from the Bondtech website. Use a razor blade and cut just a tiny little piece off to ensure that you have a very nice square end on this piece of Capricorn tube. And you can see that it did a nice job there. From there, you're going to ram it in the top of that adapter as far as it'll go, so it bottoms out, and you're ramming in the side that you just cut, because of course you want a nice fit inside of there. Now you can slide on the tool and you can make another cut, and this is going to give you the perfect distance that the Capricorn tube is going to be sticking out from the top of your hot end, such that it fits perfectly into the DDX extruder. Here you can see I've completely removed the socket head cap screws that hold the DDX extruder together. You do not have to do this. I'm just doing this to show you what the two halves look like and to show you how that adapter interfaces with the DDX extruder. So the side there that I'm got facing up right now with those two holes with the bosses that stick up, they're going to be facing up in the same direction as that gear. And you can see how it all kind of gets sandwiched together here. And again, you do not have to do this. You can just loosen them off enough that you can slip it in the right direction. But again, I'm just showing this for clarity. So you can see how the side of the Mosquito hot end with the Slice Engineering script is facing the back side of the DDX extruder, where you would route all of your wires. So you can see those channels where the wires would normally be routed, and I'm just putting the bolts back in because of course I'm going to reassemble this whole thing with the pancake stepper. So now that I have everything reassembled, you can see how it looks. Again, take note of the direction of the script on the hot end if you're using the Mosquito Magnum hot end. But now we can move on to installing the heater cartridge and the thermistor. Both of these I got from Slice Engineering, so I got a 24 volt 50 watt heater cartridge, and I've got the 300 degree thermistor from them. Now there is a little spacer, if you want to call it that I've shoved into the one end of the receptacle for the thermistor, and that's just going to make sure that it can bottom out properly. And now I'm applying some thermal paste, just a little dab. We're going to throw it in the receptacle there, turn it a little bit, and distribute that thermal paste. And then I can do the same thing to the heater cartridge and get it in. Now in this clip, I've installed it on the right hand side with the wires coming out. However, you'll see in a moment that this doesn't quite work out for me, and I'm going to have to put it in on the other side. So your wires may interfere with the fan that you're going to eventually install. So I would actually recommend putting it in on the left hand side. But regardless, you can tighten down the retaining bolt. There's one on either side, and so that's just going to retain the heater cartridge and thermistor. I'm just making sure the other side is tight. And again, you can see the channels for routing your wires, and you'll find out, like I said, that it's in the wrong side anyways, but we'll get to that later. Now I'm just disassembling the old harness from the Creality Ender 5 Plus, because we're going to be reusing a few things, and I'm going to pull out the old thermistor and heater cartridge wires. I'm going to get rid of the old hot end, and I'm going to be reusing the harness for the BLTouch, and I think I'm going to be also reusing here a part of the stepper motor harness. So now you can go ahead and remove the BLTouch unit from the mount. So we will not be reusing this Creality mount, so you can just put it aside, get rid of it if you never plan on going back to the old hot end. You're going to take your new adapter for the BLTouch, and we're going to install the BLTouch module like so. So you're going to slip it into that slot, and from the top side here, I'm going to be inserting these little bolts that came with the original BLTouch, and they should thread right into the 3D printed plastic. Looking at the entire assembly, you can also see now that I've threaded in a brass nozzle. I went with a 0.8mm nozzle because I want to push out a lot more plastic with this whole extruder setup. And the Mosquito hot end accepts the E3D style nozzles. Now we're going to look at the harness again with the extruder fan and the part cooling fan. We're going to take our part cooling fan and we're going to take the fan duct that came with the Creality kit from Bondtech, and we're going to set that up. And so you can see how those two parts fit together. The fan duct is going to be mounted with some reused hardware from the original part cooling fan. Take note, there is a short bolt and long bolt. When you get the parts in your hands, it'll make sense which one goes where. The fan mount that comes with the DDX kit also has a little arrow on it, so take note that the arrow points upwards. You can see how it goes diagonally across the part cooling fan, and you're going to again reuse some of the M3 hardware and thread that into the mount that again came with the DDX kit. And the parts are now connected. There's a long bolt here that goes through all three parts, so the duct, the fan, and then the mount, and that will complete this little sub-assembly of the part cooling fan and duct. Now I'm going to take that fan sub-assembly and I'm going to connect it to the side of the DDX extruder, but you can see my wires in the way. So this is what I had mentioned earlier. I put them on the wrong side for this application, so I swapped them over to the left-hand side, and now I can fit my part cooling fan, and you can very clearly see where it fits. There's a slotted hole, and there's some guides that you can adjust this part cooling fan up and down for the perfect placement. Looking through the inside of the extruder, you can see where I've got that M3 bolt going through, and that goes into the brass threaded insert into the part cooling fan mount. And you don't want to completely tighten it down at this point. You want to leave it just loose enough that you can make some adjustments, such that your fan duct is going to sit just above the end of your nozzle, because of course you do not want it sitting below so that it interferes with your print. Once you get it in a reasonable position, you can tighten that bolt down to finalize the placement of your part cooling fan. The BLTouch assembly is next on the list, and so it goes on the other side. So it has a slotted hole, and you'll see two holes that the M3 bolts will thread into on this side of the DDX extruder. And you can start off with trying 2 bolts. I'll just cut to the chase. 2 bolts won't work. It doesn't allow the BLTouch unit to go low enough. So I'm just going to be using 1 bolt here. You'll see in a minute I'm going to remove the second bolt. So I'm going to just install the lower bolt, and the upper one I will remove. Now, even with 1 bolt, the BLTouch unit will not skew. You'll see that the back side is flat on the BLTouch mount. That flat face will sit flush with the X carriage on the Creality unit, and so that's going to prevent the BLTouch unit from rotating or skewing. So don't worry about that if you think that 1 bolt won't hold it, because in this case it will. And you can make the adjustments now or later, but there is a spec on the BLTouch unit, so the version 3.1, and the distance between the nozzle and the probe. Now you can't quite install the extruder fan just yet because you're going to need access to the 2 holes inside to put in some M3 bolts in order to mount the entire DDX assembly to your Creality X carriage. Now I found that the original Creality bolts were not long enough, and so I ended up having to get some longer M3 socket head cap screws, and you just kind of slip those in and friction will hold them in place for now. I'm going to connect the extruder stepper motor adapter harness. So this adapts the wiring pinout from the pancake motor that's included with the DDX kit to the Creality wiring harness. And so there's a little card that comes with the kit to make sure that everything is in place and you got the proper pinout such that you do not damage your stepper motor. And I'm going to do a little bit of wire management here. And so you can see that I'm just sorting everything out and kind of getting it in place. There's a channel for a zip tie that again comes with the DDX kit. It slides through that channel and up and out the other side, and it's going to kind of hold things in place, at least temporarily, while you get the whole assembly onto the X carriage. Now we can take this entire DDX unit and we can get it installed onto the X carriage. And so you can see on the X carriage there are 2 mounting bosses here, and we're going to line those up with 2 registers on the back of the DDX. So they're going to kind of press into place very lightly, and that sort of locates the whole DDX assembly onto the X carriage, and those bolts that we slipped in earlier are ready to be tightened down. At this point, make sure the back of your DDX assembly is sitting flat with the X carriage. Make sure none of your wires are trapped or pinched, and then you can go back to the front and you can install your extruder fan, and that installs with 3 bolts in the front. The top right hand one is not used. I've also sort of just mocked up the wiring loop from my hot end down to the back side of this printer, and I've temporarily held it in place with that red zip tie that you see there at the back. And this is just going to kind of keep things neat and tidy for now. And we're going to look at the old Bowden tube assembly here. So this is the extruder motor from the old Bowden tube setup. We're going to remove the lever with 1 bolt, and we're also going to remove the hobbed gear on the stepper motor. So a set screw or 2 will loosen off and it'll pull right off the drive shaft. I got my Capricorn tube. I'm going to loosely fasten that to my wire loop with some zip ties. They don't have to be overly tight. Next comes the tensioner knob. That just threads all the way in. You can bottom it out and then just back it off a turn. And finally, you're going to put your X carriage belt back onto the X carriage. But I found here that it is obstructed by the park cooling fan. So I'm going to have to loosen that off and just wiggle that X carriage belt back in and tighten everything back down. And back to the left hand side of your X gantry, you can return to those 2 bolts that we started with, and you can tighten those down and tension up your X carriage belt. And it's time to now visit the rod holders for the Z-axis. And so those stock rod holders that come with the Creality printer will interfere with the DDX assembly, and so we're going to replace them with some 3D printed ones. Again, you can find the models for these on the Bondtech website, or you can buy them directly from Bondtech. Make sure that once you install those Z rod holders, that you push your Z rods down to be flush with the top of that holder, such that your new DDX assembly will clear them in the case of moving your print head to the extreme ends of your print bed. One thing I'm a little bit picky about is the wiring inside of the control enclosure, and somebody else had already been inside of this enclosure, and so I wanted to clean up the wiring and make sure everything looks good. So I tried a little bit more wire management inside of here. I removed the power supply unit and ran all the wires underneath of it properly and tied them down nicely. I also added a second hole to allow wire bundles to exit from. So now one wire bundle is responsible for the hot end, and the second wire bundle is responsible for the heated bed, extruder motors, and end stops. And so this hot end bundle that we're looking at right now, I've connected the wires with these Molex Microfit 3.0 power connector kit connectors. They're good for 5 amps, so this should be more than sufficient for the amperage that we're running from our hot end back to the control board. And I'm going to use some heat shrink tubing here once I verify that everything works. I'm going to lock those connectors into place. And in the future, if I ever need to disconnect those connectors, I can just cut through the heat shrink tubing. Next, I put the printer on its side so I can access the bottom of the control unit while it's bolted back into the frame. And we're going to apply the stepper current adjustment that's recommended on the Bondtech website. So again, I'm doing this on an Ender 5 Plus, but depending on the Creality machine that you might have a different control board. I put all the links in the description down below. You can find the link to this procedure. You're going to find your control board and you're going to adjust the extruder trim pot to the appropriate voltage. So you're going to need a multimeter to measure the voltage. So the positive probe is going to go on the trim pot, and you're going to find a grounding negative place for your negative ground probe, and you're going to adjust it to the recommended voltage from Bondtech. And so you see here, I have my little trim pot there, and I'm going to make that adjustment to get it within the appropriate voltage range. Next up is the firmware update for your printer. And so you can see on the Bondtech website, they have a page dedicated to Creality printers and all of the different variations of images that you can download from their website. But it recommends first that you update your screen firmware. And so on the Creality website, they have the latest firmware for the screen. There's this DWin folder that will be put onto an SD card. Make sure it's the only thing on that SD card. You're going to pop the SD card into the back of the screen. There's a SD card slot for that. Turn your printer on. It will automatically update the screen firmware. Once that's done, come back to the Bondtech website, figure out which combination of upgrades you did. In my case, I got the 50-watt heater, I have the 300-degree thermistor, and I got BLTouch. So I'm going to work my way down this page. I'm going to find the drop-down menu for Ender 5 Plus. And you can see here they have a hex file that supports BLTouch. I'm going to go over to the column for the 300-degree thermistor and my 50-watt heater. So I'm going to download that hex file, and then I'm going to connect my main board to my computer through USB, and I'm going to use a program called Xloader to load that hex file onto the controller. With the firmware successfully updated, we can get back into some general printer adjustments here. So I've taken my print bed and I've bottomed out all of the bed leveling adjusters. So you can see here on my Ender 5 Plus, it is completely bottomed out. And looking at it from a little bit of a further perspective here, you can see that I'm going to take a digital caliper and I'm going to measure from the top of the X gantry to the top of the print bed. And I've got this gantry centered over the print bed. So I've got my right hand side and my left hand side. Now this is clearly not how you properly level a bed, but what I'm doing here is I'm making sure the two sides are even, because this machine has dual Z rods. And so this is, like I said, not print bed leveling. This is making sure that my two Z rods are adjusted properly and they are not out of sync. This is why I first bottomed out all of the bed leveling adjusters. So if those distances between the top of your gantry and the print bed at that center line are not even, you can make individual adjustments to your Z rods to even those measurements out. And that makes sure that you don't have your entire plate skewed on your Z rods. Back at the bed leveling screws, I'm using this feeler gauge here to introduce a small gap at all four corners. This is going to give me enough adjustment when I go to eventually level the bed in both directions, so up and down. That should more or less be enough. Keep in mind, earlier in the video I did mention there's a spec from the BLTouch probe to the nozzle. That measurement can be found on this website here for version 3.1 of the BLTouch. Link is in the video description. So with that properly adjusted, we can almost start leveling our bed. Don't forget before you level your bed that you need to tighten down your nozzle. And so you're gonna preheat that nozzle to a pretty reasonable temperature. I find 250 degrees is good enough for me. Get that heated up and snug it down with any tool that you can use to snug it down. In this case, I'm just using a little mini ratchet. Do not over tighten it. Now we can get into the bed leveling procedure. So I'm going to be using the business card method here, something slightly thicker than a piece of standard paper. I'm going to be using the Creality auxiliary leveling or manual leveling system. I'm not going to be using the BLTouch auto bed leveling. I'm really not going to get into why, but I just really don't think it's necessary. Even on a print bed as big as this one, I have absolutely no use for it, and I find it just complicates things and causes more headaches. And so with a good manual leveling at all four corners, I'm going to start my first test print. This clip is being run at 5 times speed, so don't get too excited about this extruder. It is really good though, but basically I'm printing off a strain relief for my Ender 5 Plus heated bed. If you have an Ender 5 Plus, I would highly recommend this modification because those wires just kind of precariously hang there otherwise, and there really isn't a proper strain relief on that heated bed. So this is a great upgrade. One other highly recommended modification here is this little 3D printed wire guide / strain relief, and this is going to take your extruder wiring harness and guide it up in a nice generous loop up to your print head. Now my biggest criticism of this DDX assembly is the lack of proper strain relief. I really felt that this tiny little zip tie here wasn't really enough, and I think over time it's going to cause problems. And so there's 3 holes that seem to be kind of be unused on the back of this DDX assembly. I designed the strain relief that should interface with those 3 holes, and I'm just going to use some plastic tapping screws. I'm going to bolt it into those 3 holes and just screw it down into place. And then I can zip tie my wire bundle around the strain relief, and I think that'll provide a bit more of a gentle support for that wiring harness such that the zip tie will not cut into those wires. With the plastic tapping screws in place and the zip ties also holding the wiring harness, you can see what it looks like, and I'm quite happy with that. If you do use my model, just make sure that the zip tie here that is guiding the filament tube is not too tight. You don't want to create obstructions. And with the tensioning arm open, you can see one of the holes that I had used for mounting my strain relief. They go right through that DDX assembly, so don't use screws that are too long because you don't want them getting in there and interfering with the inner workings of your extruder. And so with everything all now complete, I've got my print profile dialed in, and I'm getting some really nice prints with my 0.8mm nozzle. The Slice Engineering Magnum Mosquito hot end can really put out quite a bit of flow, and it has dramatically decreased my print times. So I'm really happy with the result here. And so that's it for this video. I hope you guys found it useful, and I hope your 3D printer is a lot more capable now. If something was unclear or you guys have any more questions, please put your comments in the comment section down below. I try and get back to everybody. And if you found this video useful, please hit that like button as it encourages me to make more content like this. And in the future, you'll see much more 3D printing and maker content to come. Thanks for watching.